Most financial advice begins with the same assumption, that money is primarily a matter of discipline. Spend responsibly, save consistently, avoid unnecessary risk. If the behavior is correct, the outcome should improve. This framing turns money into a personal management problem, a matter of habits, choices, self-control. And there is some truth in that. Irresponsible behavior can destroy financial stability. Excessive debt, reckless speculation, chronic overspending. These behaviors create obvious damage, so financial advice often focuses on preventing them. But preventing mistakes is not the same thing as explaining how wealth actually forms inside an economic system. Avoiding damage protects stability. It does not automatically produce expansion. And expansion is where wealth tends to accumulate. This is the quiet limitation of most financial advice. It is designed to reduce harm, not necessarily to explain how the system distributes opportunity. Because the system does not operate primarily on personal discipline, it operates on incentives. Every financial structure contains incentives. Banks lend money because lending generates interest. Investment funds gather capital because management fees grow with assets. Corporations pursue growth because growth increases valuation. These incentives shape how money moves. They influence where capital flows. They influence what opportunities become visible and which ones remain invisible. But everyday financial advice rarely begins with incentives. It begins with behavior. Spend less, save more, be patient. These rules treat the individual as the center of the financial equation. But individuals operate inside a much larger structure, a structure that constantly reallocates capital. Markets expand in certain sectors. Credit becomes easier or harder to access. Asset prices inflate or stagnate. Entire industries rise and fall. These shifts are not controlled by personal discipline. They are shaped by institutional decisions, policy changes, market incentives. And because these forces operate continuously in the background, they influence outcomes far more than most people realize. A person may behave responsibly for years, saving, budgeting, avoiding unnecessary spending. But if the system surrounding them is inflating asset prices faster than their savings accumulate, the gap between discipline and opportunity quietly widens. This is why financial advice built purely around behavior often feels incomplete, not because the advice is wrong, but because it describes only one layer of the system, the personal layer. What it rarely explains is the structural layer beneath it, the incentives that determine where capital flows, the mechanisms that determine how wealth compounds, the structures that quietly reward some positions within the system and slow others down. Understanding those structures changes the entire interpretation of financial advice, because the system is not simply a test of discipline. It is a landscape of incentives, and the outcomes people experience often reflect where they stand within that landscape, far more than how carefully they manage their spending. Once incentives enter the conversation, the system begins to look very different. Financial systems are not neutral environments. They are built around motivations. Banks lend because lending produces interest. Investment firms gather capital because management fees scale with assets. Corporations pursue growth because growth increases valuation. Every institution inside the financial system responds to incentives. Those incentives determine where money flows. They determine which activities expand and which ones remain constrained. This is rarely explained in everyday financial advice. Advice tends to speak in neutral language. Spend responsibly. Invest carefully. Plan for the future. But the system itself is not neutral. It is structured around financial rewards. Credit expands when lending is profitable. Asset markets grow when capital flows toward them. Entire industries accelerate when investors see opportunity. These movements shape the environment individuals operate inside, long before personal financial decisions even begin. Consider something simple: housing. Housing markets are influenced by far more than individual buyers saving for a home. Interest rates determine borrowing costs. Investment funds allocate capital toward real estate. Developers respond to profit incentives when building supply. All of these forces influence housing prices, often far more dramatically than individual saving behavior. Which means a person can follow responsible advice and still find the environment moving faster than their progress. The same pattern appears in equity markets. Corporate valuations rise when capital flows toward growth sectors. Large investment funds move billions into specific industries. Institutional capital compounds inside the market structure. Individual investors participate in that system, but they do not control its direction. And this is where incentives quietly reshape outcomes. Money moves toward environments where it can multiply, toward systems designed to reward capital. Banks expand lending when it produces reliable returns. Investment funds concentrate capital where growth appears strongest. Corporations pursue expansion because markets reward scale. These incentives continuously reorganize the financial landscape. Yet most financial advice rarely begins with this layer. It begins with budgeting, spending control, savings rates. Important ideas, but ideas that describe behavior, not the forces shaping the environment. Once incentives become visible, financial advice starts to look incomplete. Not incorrect, incomplete. Because discipline alone does not determine financial outcomes. Discipline operates inside a system already moving capital in specific directions, and those directions are determined by incentives far larger than individual decisions. Understanding that shift changes how financial advice is interpreted. Advice becomes guidance for navigating behavior, but the deeper understanding comes from recognizing the incentives that shape the entire system. Because those incentives quietly determine where wealth accumulates and where progress becomes slower. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video, subscribe. More clarity is coming. Once incentives are understood, ownership. Financial systems reward different positions in very different ways. Some positions require constant effort to generate income. Others participate automatically in the expansion of the system itself. This difference shapes how wealth accumulates over long periods of time. Labor generates income through time, hours worked, tasks completed, value exchanged for compensation. When the work stops, the income usually stops as well. Ownership behaves differently. Assets do not require constant labor to participate in economic growth. They move with the system. A company expands, its equity increases in value. A city grows. Real estate within that city appreciates. Infrastructure produces ongoing cash flow as long as it remains operational. These assets are connected to the expansion of the system itself. They benefit from growth that individuals do not directly control. And over time, that connection begins to compound. Compounding is not simply about saving money. It is about participating in systems that grow. When capital sits inside appreciating assets, the system begins working alongside it. Markets expand, businesses scale, cities develop. Each of these forces pushes asset values upward over long periods of time, not smoothly, but consistently enough to shape the direction of wealth accumulation. This is why ownership becomes such a critical structural layer in financial systems. It connects capital to growth. Labor income, by contrast, often grows slowly. Wage increases tend to move gradually, negotiated, incremental. And in many economies, wage growth has struggled to keep pace with asset inflation. Housing prices rise, equity markets expand, large pools of capital compound. Meanwhile, labor income grows in smaller increments, which means individuals relying only on wages may experience slower financial acceleration over time. This difference does not appear immediately. In the short term, income can feel stable and sufficient. But over decades, the asymmetry becomes more visible. Those connected to appreciating assets move with the expansion of the system. Those relying entirely on labor must continually generate income through effort. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural observation. Financial systems distribute rewards based on position. Some positions sit closer to capital flows and asset growth. Others remain tied to labor cycles. And once this ownership layer becomes visible, the interpretation of financial advice begins to change again. Saving money remains responsible. Budgeting remains useful. Avoiding reckless decisions remains necessary. But none of those behaviors explain the structural difference between labor and ownership. They describe stability. Ownership explains acceleration. And inside most financial systems, acceleration tends to follow the path of assets connected to long-term economic growth. Once incentives and ownership are very different. Not necessarily wrong, but incomplete. Because most advice is designed for individuals managing behavior. Spend responsibly, save consistently, avoid unnecessary risk. These rules protect stability. They prevent obvious financial damage. They create discipline. But discipline alone does not explain how wealth accumulates inside a system. Wealth accumulation tends to follow structure, incentives, ownership, capital flows. These forces operate quietly in the background. They determine where money moves. They determine which positions inside the system compound faster than others. And once that becomes visible, the entire conversation shifts. Financial advice stops sounding like a full explanation. It starts sounding like an introduction. An introduction to behavior, not an explanation of the system. Because the system itself is not built around personal discipline. It is built around capital expansion. Businesses grow, markets expand, cities develop, new technologies reshape industries. Every one of these processes generates economic value, and that value flows toward positions connected to the system's growth. Assets appreciate as demand increases. Equities grow as companies scale. Infrastructure produces cash flow as long as it remains embedded in economic activity. These dynamics operate continuously, whether individuals notice them or not. Financial advice rarely begins with these mechanisms. It begins with spending habits, savings rates, risk avoidance. Useful ideas, necessary ideas, but ideas that describe how to behave with money, not how the system distributes it. Understanding that difference changes how advice is interpreted. Advice becomes a baseline, a foundation. But the deeper understanding comes from observing the structure surrounding it. where capital flows, what incentives drive the market, which assets participate in economic expansion. Once those questions become visible, financial strategy becomes clearer. Not simpler, but clearer. Because the system does not reward effort alone. It rewards positioning. Positioning within incentives, positioning within ownership structures, positioning within expanding systems. And when that perspective appears, financial advice finally begins to make sense, not as the full map, but as the first layer of understanding. If this shifted how you see the system, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.